think one of my favorite moments with Johnny Silverhand is the moment where you get to see where his body was unceremoniously dumped in the northern California desert outside of Night City. I'm V, a mercenary seeking out fame and glory, who had the consciousness of a famous rock star turned terrorist implanted in my head after a historic heist went majorly wrong. Over the course of my time in Night City, I got to do a lot of stuff. I fell in love, I drove cars, I did missions. Every moment of that was followed by Johnny as my character's Greek chorus. Usually he's just an endless fountain of quips and sardonic one-liners. Whatever you do, Johnny's got something snarky to say about it in response. That's all Johnny can often seem like, even as his character is expanded upon in my world.
Got no fucking idea what this is about. But if you don't go with them, I'm never talking to you again.
Never mind that he's played by Keanu Reeves, the avatar of sincerity in the real world.
You're breathtaking! You're all breathtaking!
But here we are in a graveyard of sorts. It's just industrial waste as far as the eye can see, smog and filth all over the place, and this is where the corporation Arasaka dumped his body after they were done with him. He tried to bomb their skyscraper and accidentally caused far more collateral damage than he intended. He gave them everything they needed to martyr themselves, and they tortured him in cyberspace for decades as punishment. But the whole time, the simulacrum of his soul was in agony. His body rotted right here. Now my V played it as a really sincere moment, where the two reaffirm their friendship despite how antagonistic their initial relationship seemed to be. It's a really nice moment between them. The game slows down and quiets down for this. But despite this, I have a lot of really mixed feelings about Cyberpunk 2077, like many people do. It might be a smash hit with characters beloved by millions, but it can't escape the shadow of its disastrous launch. There are the side missions that explore genuinely fascinating parts of the Cyberpunk genre, but it's hidden in a sea of generic missions with enemy AI that often doesn't work. It's a bundle of contradictions to me, with incredibly high highs and incredibly low lows. And there has been a lot of discourse about this game since it was released. The crunch, the abuse by its studio, its rushed launch.
Now die.
Bam.
Save yourself!
Anything about this game you want to hear about, you can hear about it. But I wanted to approach this game from a different angle than what I had seen previously. An idea that was, to quote another Cyberpunk legend,
like a splinter in your mind.
Like it or not, Johnny is the true centerpiece of the game. And on the one hand, you get a Keanu Reeves in your ear for hours on end, and for many people that's their idea of paradise, and I can't fault them for that. He's a very handsome man, his voice is like smooth butter, who am I to complain about that? But on the other hand, Johnny does not factor very much into the actual gameplay of Cyberpunk, except brief sequences where you play as him taking control of V's body, or a single flashback where he stages his altered version of his fateful attack on Arasaka. Despite how much you talk to Johnny, or hear people talk about Johnny, or learn about Johnny, he is still a several-hour cutscene who is more defined by environmental storytelling around him than the lines that Keanu is given to say. Johnny is not necessarily saying what you, the audience, should believe or interpret, but it is his perspective almost exclusively that you're exposed to throughout the game. No matter how often he's criticized, Johnny is always ending the game on a rather sympathetic note. Either he's agreeing to go with his ex-girlfriend turned digital god, the digital afterlife, or he has taken over V's body for good, and starting a new life for himself. I'm not saying that Johnny should have experienced some kind of karmic punishment for causing this much harm to our main character, just so the audience can feel like they're not agreeing with him too much. Depiction is not equal endorsement, and I don't think that CD Projekt Red is explicitly endorsing anything he's doing. And stories about genuinely awful people, even the ones who in some playthroughs can try to make amends, should exist in some form. That's not my issue with how this plays out. The issue, at least for me and many other players, is it feels like it's happening around you, rather to you. The gameplay does not really reflect the changing status of these characters at all. Each time V experiences a relic malfunction, or Johnny's influence on him or her or them growing, it's just a brief cutscene of V coughing up blood and seeing glitchy visual effects, and that's about it. Even the bits where Johnny takes control in most cases are just first-person cutscenes, made to resemble the fast-paced montages of time passing for V even when they're in control. So this is where the actual point of the arguments I'll be making today will hopefully come into play. And I'm hoping, if you're amenable, to present a hypothetical alternative to what we currently have. This is not a thing that will ever actually exist unless you're a particularly ambitious modder. It is just a hypothetical, it is a suggestion for a future game with similar mechanics or an alternate universe. I want to make clear that overall, the main plot regarding these changes is almost completely identical to what we have now. V and Johnny are still merged when the latter's relic or biochip is inserted into V's mind after a failed heist. One of them will possess the body at game's end, and one of the factions you meet will be sided with in the same ways as before. The changes are not necessarily in plot, but in mechanics to tell the identical story. But my argument, my thought experiment that I would like to share with you, is meant to find a way to integrate Johnny more into the gameplay. to make him more an active part of it, so that your connection with him does not rest entirely in the cinematic parts of the game exclusively. And I want to kind of start with my first section of that argument with a game that at first doesn't seem to have too much in common, which is the game Red Dead Redemption 2. One of the points of Red Dead Redemption 2 is that you are not actually playing as a completely customizable character. You are playing a very specific person in a specific time. You can change Arthur Morgan's clothes, you can change his hair, and you can change his horse with its revolutionary testicle mechanics. You can nudge him away from that titular redemption, and you can make him the ruthless outlaw of your dreams, but it'll never be you. A large complaint with Cyberpunk that I've seen, and one that I have to agree with, is that V ends up an extremely generic character no matter what you do, because they have to be a blank slate to accommodate player choice as best as possible. That is the trade-off between the two approaches to game design despite the similar open-world settings. One version has you playing a specific person with only limited control over the course of his life. The other is a lot more expansive, with a lot more opportunities for immersion gameplay, but at the cost of any genuine personality. And that's what I think would bridge the gap I find between both. Adding a journal, like what can be found in Red Dead Redemption 2, but not as we see it in the current game of Cyberpunk 27, which I do enjoy. Now, V writes these entries from the perspective of Jackie Wells, their best friend who dies in the first heist no matter what you do. It is the only actual indication of their personality you're going to get, beyond how much you can customize V and the limited responses you can give the characters whenever they talk to you. What I'm proposing is a handwritten addition to that journal you can check exactly the same way you can with Arthur Morgan in Red Dead Redemption 2, but purely copying that mechanic alone won't really cut it. Where it can become interesting, whereas that game's particular reaction to each story and side mission alone, is what might happen once Johnny enters the picture. I want you to imagine a scenario with me very briefly of how this could be implemented. You get a few entries in this journal by yourself before Johnny arrives in your life with Jackie Wells. It depends on the life path that you've taken. The game offers 3. You could be a street kid, a corpo, or a nomad. It can fill in some of the gaps that you see during a particular time skip that happens during this montage in between the very first mission of the game and the first heist where Johnny first appears. And then finally, Jackie dies. The biochip or the relic containing Johnny's personality or soul is implanted into V's head, and then Johnny is there. Now in the game proper, Johnny just arrives almost immediately, with no real warning as to what's going on. It works, but the only change that I would suggest here is to slightly delay Johnny's proper introduction. To have him show up as a sleepwalker that you don't know about. V wakes up and their apartment has been trashed. Something has been written in the journal. Maybe a few entries in writing that they don't recognize. They can try to consult whoever they can, like their Ripperdoc who's called Victor, but the security footage of their room at night shows that they're doing all of this themselves. V doesn't get it. And a few more fitful nights of this, maybe through a cutscene, and then Johnny appears exactly the way he does in the current game. But after that, they don't only interact exactly as they do before as a veritable buffet of dialogue options, but also in the journal based on V's choices. This would shift based on their relationship to each other. Let's say, for example, that V is in the process of romancing a character called Judy Alvarez, and she is slowly falling in love with them after the death of one of their best friends. In the journal, we could see written down Johnny being supportive and encouraging if they're good with each other, Johnny being mostly apathetic and annoyed if they're neutral, and Johnny being a living, intrusive thought if you hate each other. Imagine journal entries of Johnny highlighting all of V's insecurities, taunting them for daring to hit on a woman who has just lost one of her best friends, valuing getting off over falling in love. In contrast, the version where you get along has Johnny telling you how lucky Judy would be to date you, how considerate you're being. Johnny's already a vicious bastard as is, but with an abundance of written dialogue that Keanu does not have to voice, it could be that much more chilling or heartwarming depending on the relationship, which is a factor that already exists in the game that we have. Because this is not the only change that I would make in this hypothetical perfect world. The second and far larger change could genuinely grapple with the themes of the game in gameplay, and not just in dialogue and cinematics. The entire game hinges around the question of whether you can get Johnny's mind, his biochip, out of your body, and if you even want to. The question of your very identity is called into question as his influence grows and grows. It is inherently a really fascinating story that I wanted to get to the bottom of, but I couldn't help but be a bit underwhelmed when the entire thing hinged on a single dialogue choice at the very end of the game. But I still wanted such a consequential choice in the narrative to have much more impact than a dialogue choice, and I certainly felt a little conflicted by my answer to that choice. I took back my body, I let Johnny go into the digital afterlife, and it was only because Johnny was an entertaining enough character and he was fun to talk to, but that's it. I didn't really feel that much of a connection to him despite how much I enjoyed the scene at his final resting place that I told you about before, or when I helped get his band back together, or helping to tie up his loose ends. I did enjoy these moments a lot, but I felt emotionally distant from them all the same. The question I kept asking myself as I was playing was how to integrate these two opposing ideas, a fascinating narrative about the nature of identity and gameplay that went And then the second idea, the thing that I feel like would add a lot more emergent gameplay and also integrate Johnny a little bit more into it as opposed to just being someone who talks at you rather than to you and having the gameplay feel directly connected to him. I did talk about the time, briefly, that Johnny takes control of V's body, mostly through cutscenes you can't control. The way this happens, whether it's for a date with an old flame or settling a score with his old band members, V takes a pill called pseudo-endotrizine, which is not a real substance as far as I know, which essentially lets him take the reins until he takes another pill to switch control back to V. It's a factor in many of the side missions directly involving Johnny, largely agreed upon to be some of the best content in the game, where each shift creates more of a strain on V, but never truly impacting you, the player. We know that V is impacted, but not you, and you can do this without making the gameplay more irritating. But of course, if you try to reflect this strain by having V move slower or shoot worse to simulate their increasing strain, is not how we want to approach this in a gameplay design. We don't want this to be intentionally tedious. But we already have the pseudo-endotrizine, the entity that already exists as a major plot point of the game, and it lets us, in this hypothetical scenario, have our cake and eat it too. So, again, I would like for you to imagine with me another scenario of how this might implement itself. Imagine that instead of only taking these body-switching pills in predetermined cutscenes, you can access a limited supply of pseudo-endotrizine, which is relatively expensive at certain shops, but not as expensive as the kinds of implants that give the game most of its narrative and gameplay heft. Taking this pill in combat or in conversation is the same effect. It gives Johnny the reins for a few minutes, and while you're him, you get a boost to all of your moves. You get an accentuated version of every implant you already have. You can briefly stop time. You can jump between walls. You are a living power fantasy. It is your ultimate move, but it is one you have to earn enough money to take advantage of during the really tough missions. The first one could be free, after all. Maybe Johnny provides that option himself to survive a particularly tough encounter. But after the first time, there is some warnings about its overuse from maybe a few characters. Maybe Victor the Ripper Dog might be best for that. And either V or you heeds that warning or you don't. And if it's done outside of combat, there is unique dialogue options and conversations from Johnny's perspective, further enriching the narrative. Nothing too in-depth, just mainly quirky fun things that make you think that Johnny is the coolest motherfucker around, and so on. But you've been warned by maybe Victor, and even Johnny himself if he likes you, not to take it too much. It's pretty expensive to get, like I said, but not as expensive as the implants, which are the hardest things to get in the game, except for, I guess, the cars. So you would end up seeing it as a mostly costly but good get-out-of-jail-free card. But here's the thing. The warnings are an unintentional red herring. Not that they're not true, but it is not the frequency of the body-switching pill's dose that matters, but rather the amount of times you take a dose of pseudo-endotrizine. Now, 1 or 2 times is probably too few for this, so let's say 5 as a number that you don't know that you've reached. And let's say that the 6th time you take it in a really bad situation, that an invisible d20 suddenly rolls. If it lands on 19 out of 20 numbers, all is well and you get the same effects again. But then maybe the die size reduces each time after that, from a d20 to a d12 to a d10 to a d8, and so on. And at some point, as this number reduces, as the amount of sides in the die that you don't see goes down, eventually you will roll a 1. And after you roll it, unknowingly, when the combat ends, or if a conversation ends, V starts to get a little sick. We see a relic malfunction, but this time they start rambling about needing sleep. They go to the nearest bed, and regardless of your relationship, this pill has pushed them past the limit, and now Johnny, whether he wants to or not, is taking over V's body for good. Now, a good Johnny would react with horror and desperately try to figure out how to prevent it. A neutral Johnny is apathetic and shrugs off V's growing concern, and bad Johnny outright gloats at V's impending death, and boom. V is Johnny for the rest of the game. But that's not where it ends. Johnny now has the choice of how he wants to address every relationship that V has already developed. Does he try to imitate V for as long as possible, finding it harder and harder as time goes on? Does he drop the act and be able to either convince people to give his new self a chance or burn the relationships down entirely? Different characters would have different reactions based on how V has talked about Johnny. Carrie, his old bandmate who was in love with him, would obviously be overjoyed, but how would, say, Judy, or the private investigator River, or the scavenger Panam feel about V being gone? Would they grieve? Would Johnny help them grieve? Would Johnny be able to build a romance with them in turn? And for the sake of not going to too dark of a place, I would not want a situation where Johnny tricks a romantic interest into sleeping with him, thinking that he's still V. But other than that, deciding how these relationships grow and change would have an actively new context to everything that arrives now. The rest of the game would go as planned, even if the choices are now only to follow Alt into pure cyberspace, or go back into V's body for good. But there's one more little wrinkle in the scenario that I like to imagine as we approach this slightly altered ending. This is not guaranteed to happen, of course. Maybe V only takes it a few times, and you still end up getting the game exactly as is before. You still have a V who remains some kind of control the whole time. Now, of course, even the nicest version of Johnny is still a narcissist clearly wanting to fully assert control however he can. We already have pre-scripted scenes of Johnny taking control of V's body in what we have, so why could we not apply that to the game itself? Imagine that a little while after the full switch happens, for the first time while you're roaming around, not during a story or side mission, you pass by some sort of secret hideout where Johnny has stored a backup wardrobe before being captured by Arasaka. You lose control of the car or the steps you take. Either you see yourself walking to it if it's not too long, or skipping the static if it would be longer than a couple minutes. And suddenly you're in one of the two outfits that Johnny wears throughout the game. This begins to happen anytime you're not in a story or side mission, and if you're near a Ripper Dock or near one of V's old residences. Suddenly, for seconds or a couple minutes at a time, you lose control and another part of you is altered. You start growing facial hair if you didn't have them before. Or you go to the Ripper Dock or barber and have it shaved. Your short hair grows long, your long hair is cut. The final cosmetic change, if it wasn't already made, is to have V's arm cut off if it's still there, and have Johnny's arm installed in its place. The only things that wouldn't change are skin color, body type, and genitals, which would always be controlled by the player. But in all other respects, you look like Johnny now no matter what. And this extends to combat and vehicles as well. Slowly, one implant and one weapon at a time becomes inaccessible to you, and Johnny refuses to use it. You hear him say something like, "That's what V would do, but I'm not V." Even the best version of Johnny wants to assert control over his body and, by extension, you. Maybe after a few presses of the equip button at first, Johnny acquiesces. You were no longer playing just V, but the final remnants of V's instinctual responses and Johnny. But slowly and surely, if you took the pills too often, Johnny wins, until only his pistols and a katana are available as combat options. To be fair, he's damn good with them, and you can still sneak and use those tactics against anyone you want. But just with those limited weapons, this goes to vehicles, where eventually you can steal anything you want, but you can only call his ancient car as an option in the call menu. Your restrictions are slowly increased even as what is left is still quite powerful. It slowly stops being your story and starts to be Johnny's. This would not happen all at once or even that quickly. Not much happening that fast would be irritating, but having a slow reversal specifically only if this individual thing happened is just an idea. Nothing more. A way to potentially make Johnny into gameplay and not just something said at you. He is something that happens to you. All of these new mechanics in the imaginary world where CD Projekt Red does not exploit its workers and has no crunch and doesn't release a game 2 years earlier than it should, would bring the themes that much more into focus. Sure, it's an incredibly ambitious idea and I've never designed a game in my life, but it is just a hypothetical. A thought that couldn't escape my head the more I thought about what left me wanting more when the credits rolled. It's something that I can't stop thinking about, and maybe it's something that you can't stop thinking about either. But of course, what we have now is still really good in lots of ways. It's just lacking in other ways, and it's something that I couldn't stop thinking about. Thank you for joining me. I hope to see you again soon.